800. That is roughly how many casualties George Patton's Third Army took trying to capture a single fort outside the French city of Metz in the fall of 1944. Not the city, not the whole campaign. One fort, held by a garrison of about 300 German soldiers. When the fighting finally stopped, Patton's own men were the ones who pulled back, and the flag flying over that fort was still German. We're going to tell you everything about what happened at Metz today, but I have to warn you that some of what follows will complicate the version of this story you already know. Now, if you're still here, let's start with the general everyone thought had already won this part of the war, and then we'll get into why Metz proved him wrong. This was not supposed to slow down at all. By the end of August 1944, Patton's Third Army had spent barely 3 weeks doing something almost nobody on either side of the front thought was possible at that speed, breaking out of Normandy and sprinting nearly all the way across France, covering more ground in less time than any American army had managed against organized resistance in the entire war. Patton believed, and said so to the men around him, that Germany itself might be reachable before winter if the pace held. It did not hold. Fuel deliveries meant for Third Army were redirected north in early September to support Montgomery's push into the Netherlands, and Patton's tanks, some of them sitting with barely enough gasoline to idle, rolled to a stop within sight of a city that had been sitting on the road to Germany for longer than most of the men fighting over it in 1944 understood. That city was Metz, and it was not simply another French town in the way. Metz had spent more than 2,000 years as one of the most fought-over pieces of ground in Europe, and after France lost it to the newly unified German Empire in 1871, German military engineers spent the following decades turning the hills around it into one of the most heavily fortified positions on the continent. By 1944, the city was ringed by a system the Germans called the Feste, dozens of individual forts connected by tunnels, rail lines, and telephone cable, built from reinforced concrete, sunk into hillsides, and designed from the start to survive an artillery bombardment far heavier than anything available to the army that eventually had to take them. Roughly 43 of these positions surrounded the city by the autumn of 1944, held by close to 14,000 German troops under General Otto von Knobelsdorff, a mixed force built around the 462nd Volksgrenadier Division that was undersupplied and, on paper, unimpressive next to the army rolling toward it, and dug into some of the best defensive engineering in Europe regardless. The largest single position in the system, the Hackenberg complex east of the river, ran more than 17 kilometers of tunnel beneath the hills, linking multiple retractable gun turrets, barracks, and ammunition magazines into a single fortress that no single artillery strike could meaningfully damage, because there was no single point where all of it could be hit at once. Fort Driant sat 5 miles southwest of the city, on high ground overlooking the Moselle River, built originally in 1902 and updated since. Armed with 150mm guns in retractable steel turrets, surrounded by a dry moat, and connected below ground to barracks, ammunition stores, and firing positions that let its garrison of roughly 300 men disappear underground the moment an attack began, and reappear somewhere else entirely once it looked safe to do so. It was, on the map Patton's staff were working from in September 1944, one obstacle among several standing between Third Army and the German border. It did not look, on paper, like the kind of position that should have been able to stop an army that had just crossed France in 3 weeks. Patton's own staff assessed it before the attack as a position that could be reduced in a matter of days, once artillery and infantry were brought to bear on it properly. An assumption built more on the momentum of the previous month than on any close study of what was actually built into the hillside. The first attempts to get across the Moselle and into the city came in early September, before the fuel crisis had fully set in, when the 5th Infantry Division launched a hasty crossing near the village of Dorneau on September 7th and 8th. It went badly almost immediately. The bridgehead the division managed to establish came under fire from German positions on higher ground on both flanks, including guns from the fort system itself, and the crossing was eventually called off, with the small foothold across the river abandoned, rather than reinforced into something that could actually hold. The 2nd Battalion of the division's 11th Infantry Regiment led the crossing, and once it was across the river, it faced 26 separate German counterattacks in the space of about 48 hours, thrown at it largely by the 17th SS Panzer Grenadier Division. while long-range guns firing from Fort Driant itself made it impossible for American engineers to complete a proper bridge behind the infantry that could have brought armor and heavy weapons across to support them. By September 11th, with the bridgehead still isolated and the casualties mounting, the position was evacuated entirely. The division found more success a few miles south at Arnaville 2 days later, where engineers managed to complete a crossing under cover of darkness before the guns on the high ground could range in on it. But the lesson from Dorneau held for the rest of the campaign regardless. Any crossing point within range of the fort system was going to bleed for every yard of progress it made. It was an early, costly signal that the ring of forts around Metz was not going to behave like the open, fast-moving terrain Third Army had just spent 3 weeks tearing through. On September 27th, with the fuel situation only partially eased and the autumn rains already turning the ground around the river into standing mud, Patton ordered a direct assault on Fort Driant itself, on the theory that taking the single most dominant position in the fort system would unlock the rest of the ring. What followed became, by most later military assessments, the only outright tactical defeat Patton suffered in the entire war. American infantry and tank destroyers attacked Driant repeatedly over the following 2.5 weeks, in daylight and at night, and neither approach worked the way the plan assumed it would. Daytime assaults exposed the attackers to observed artillery fire from the neighboring forts in the same system, positions built specifically to support each other the moment any one of them came under attack. Night assaults, meant to get infantry close enough to the fort to neutralize its defenses before daylight exposed them again, ran into German troops who simply withdrew into the tunnel network beneath the fort the moment American soldiers got close, then re-emerged from entirely different entrances once the attackers had pushed past, cutting off the men who thought they had broken through. Flamethrowers and demolition charges were used against individual bunkers and gun positions, with only local, temporary success, because the tunnel system let the garrison route around whatever had just been destroyed on the surface. American soldiers who fought there afterward described the terrain on top of the fort, churned by weeks of shell fire, into a cratered, colorless moonscape, as fighting on the face of the moon. A single day of fighting on the surface of Driant could look, by the accounts of the men who lived through several of them, almost indistinguishable from the day before it. Artillery would open the morning, infantry would push forward across ground already cratered by the previous week's shelling. German defenders would let them get close before opening fire from bunkers that had looked abandoned an hour earlier, and by evening, the same 50 or 100 yards of ground would still be contested, sometimes held by neither side outright, sometimes held by both at once, in different corners of the same position. Tank destroyers brought up to fire directly into bunker openings found their rounds sometimes did no more than chip the reinforced concrete they were aimed at, built decades earlier to survive exactly that kind of punishment. If this story is landing the way it should, hit the like button right now. It helps us keep making videos like this one. By early October, it had become clear to the officers actually running the assault that Fort Driant was not going to fall to the forces committed against it, and that continuing to feed men into the position was producing casualties without producing any corresponding progress. On the night of October 12th and 13th, the remaining American troops on Fort Driant were quietly withdrawn. The 5th Infantry Division had taken on the order of 800 casualties in the attempt, 64 killed, several hundred wounded, and close to 200 missing or captured, and had nothing to show for it. The fort remained in German hands. It would stay that way for another 2 months. Patton himself, by the accounts of officers close to him that October, did not treat the withdrawal as a footnote. He recommended to Bradley directly that the assault be called off rather than reinforced further, and Bradley agreed with the recommendation without much argument, an unusually quick and unresisted admission from a commander who had spent the previous 3 months insisting that momentum, not caution, was what won battles. It was one of the few moments in his entire combat record where Patton's own instinct ran toward pulling back rather than pushing harder, and it came directly out of watching 800 casualties accumulate against a fort his own staff had originally assessed as a manageable objective. The mud made everything about the wider campaign worse. At the same time, the fort fight was failing. The autumn of 1944 brought some of the heaviest rainfall the region had seen in years, turning roads into standing water and fields into ground that swallowed trucks and tank tracks alike. At the exact moment, Third Army's fuel allocation had already been cut to support Montgomery's operations further north. Manton Eddy, commanding the 12th Corps on Third Army's other flank, raised the flooded, unworkable ground with Patton directly and asked whether an attack scheduled during the worst of the weather could be delayed. Patton's answer, recorded by the officers who heard it, was 2 words: attack or name your replacement. The attack went forward on schedule. Patton had built his entire reputation on refusing to let weather, terrain, or exhaustion dictate his timetable, and at Metz, that same refusal was now working against him as often as it worked for him. Trucks bringing forward what fuel and ammunition were available got stuck axle-deep in roads that had been dry ground 3 weeks earlier, and forward units sometimes waited hours for supplies that under normal conditions would have taken a fraction of that time to arrive. Men fighting in the fields around the forts described mud thick enough to pull boots off, foxholes that filled with standing water within an hour of being dug, and weapons that jammed constantly without being cleaned far more often than doctrine called for. It was, by the account of more than one officer who served through both, worse ground to fight on than almost anything Third Army had faced since Normandy's hedgerows. By mid-November, with the ground finally firming up and reinforcements arriving, Third Army abandoned the strategy of assaulting the forts head-on and shifted to a plan built around going around them instead. The 90th Infantry Division and the 10th Armored Division pushed south from positions north of the city, while the 5th Infantry Division pushed north from the south, aiming to link up on the far side of Metz and cut the garrison off from resupply or retreat, rather than reduce every fort in the ring one at a time. The double envelopment closed on November 19th, with American forces meeting on the roads leading east out of the city, and leaving the German garrison inside Metz itself surrounded, whatever happened to the individual forts still holding out around its edges. The shift in tactics mattered as much as the additional troops did. Rather than reducing each fort in turn, the way the September assaults had tried and failed to do, the November plan simply bypassed most of the ring entirely, using the roads and open ground between fortified positions to push armor and infantry past them and link up on the far side, isolating individual forts from resupply and from each other, without spending another division's worth of casualties trying to storm concrete and steel head-on. It was, in effect, the same insight that had cost the Americans 800 men at Driant to learn the hard way in October, applied correctly a month later, once the ground had firmed up enough to let armor move fast enough to make the maneuver work. On November 14th, with the city's position already collapsing, General Heinrich Kittel was appointed to take over command of the defense of Metz from Nobelsdorf, a change made too late to alter much of anything. American troops entered the city itself on November 18th. On November 21st, Kittel himself was wounded and captured when the field hospital where he was being treated was overrun by advancing American forces, and the following day, November 22nd, organized resistance inside Metz ended and the city passed into American hands for the first time since the German Empire had held it since 1871, and for the first time by direct military assault in longer than anyone fighting there in 1944 could confidently put a number on. Kittel had been wounded earlier in the fighting for the city itself and was recovering under medical care when American troops reached the hospital holding him, ending his week-old command of the city's defense in almost the same breath it had begun. He would remain a prisoner of war for nearly 3 more years, not released until 1947, long after the war that cost him the city had already ended. Newspapers covering the fall of the city reached for the same comparison almost immediately, that Metz had not fallen to a direct attack since the 5th century, when Attila the Hun's forces broke through its walls in the year 451. Modern historians treat that specific claim with more caution than the wartime press did, since the full record of every siege the city faced across 15 centuries is not as complete as a single tidy sentence implies. But the comparison landed exactly the way war correspondents wanted it to land in November 1944. Whatever the precise historical count, nobody disputed that the city had not fallen to storm in a very long time, and that Patton's Third Army had just done it anyway, 3 months later than anyone in his own headquarters had originally planned for. The city falling did not end the fighting in the fort ring around it. Individual positions kept their garrisons in place and kept resisting for weeks after Metz itself had changed hands,
cut off from the city, from each other, and from any realistic hope of relief, simply because surrendering was not an order any of their commanders had been given. Fort Driant itself, the position that had cost the 5th Infantry Division 800 casualties and produced nothing in October, finally capitulated on December 8th, its garrison surrendering not because of a renewed American assault, but because they had run out of food, water, and any plausible reason to keep holding a position that no longer connected to anything. Fort Jeanne d'Arc, guarding the northern approaches to the city, held out longer than any other position in the entire system, finally surrendering to American Third Corps troops on December 13th, nearly 3 weeks after Metz itself had already fallen and been declared secured.
Its garrison spent those final weeks isolated behind American lines, with no realistic prospect of relief, holding a position that had already lost any strategic value the moment the city around it changed hands, for reasons that had more to do with orders and institutional stubbornness on the German side than with any remaining military logic. German losses in the defense of Metz were, by post-war accounting, considerably lighter than the scale of the fighting suggested, roughly 400 killed and about 2,200 wounded across the whole defense. Close to half of the wounded evacuated before the encirclement closed around the city. Third Army's own losses across the broader Lorraine campaign that autumn ran into the tens of thousands, spread across the fighting for Metz, the forts, and the surrounding countryside. A bill paid in large part for a piece of ground the original plan had expected to clear in a matter of days, rather than the better part of 3 months. The gap between those two casualty figures is itself part of the story historians have kept coming back to since. A German garrison built mostly around an undersupplied second-line division, without significant armor of its own and outnumbered by the force besieging it, still managed to inflict and absorb a lopsided exchange in its own favor for most of 3 months, purely on the strength of ground its own army had spent 70 years preparing to defend. Military instructors studying the battle afterward have used Metz repeatedly as a case study in exactly that point, that fixed fortifications built with enough foresight can still impose costs on a numerically and technologically superior attacker that have nothing to do with the quality of the individual soldiers on either side. Newspapers back home, which had spent late August running maps of France with Patton's arrows racing toward the German border, had a harder time explaining October and November to readers who had gotten used to a war that seemed to be moving in one direction only. Coverage of the fighting around Metz was thinner and less triumphant than coverage of the drive across France had been only weeks earlier, and some correspondents openly noted the contrast, that the general famous for outrunning his own supply lines was now spending weeks at a time fighting over ground that had not moved in a month. The reputation Patton walked into Lorraine with was built entirely on speed, on the idea that the German army could not build a defensive line fast enough to actually stop him once his tanks had room to move. Metz sat directly on top of a defensive line the German army had spent 70 years building before Patton was ever born. Concrete and steel and tunnel systems that had nothing to do with how quickly the 1944 garrison could react, and everything to do with engineering decisions made under Kaiser Wilhelm, and against ground built that specifically, speed simply did not apply the way it had across the open fields of France. Patton adjusted, eventually, to a siege the fort system forced on him, rather than a war of movement he would have chosen, and it took him the better part of a season to do it. 3 weeks after Metz was finally declared secure, the German army launched its last major offensive of the war in the Ardennes, and Third Army, still recovering from the fighting Metz had cost it, was one of the forces Eisenhower called on to turn north and help stop it, arriving at Bastogne with an army that had just spent months learning, at Metz, exactly how much a fortified position could cost even the fastest commander in the theater. The same army that had been bled and slowed by concrete forts built under Kaiser Wilhelm now had to pivot immediately into a winter relief march that would become one of the most celebrated movements of the entire war. And it did so without the benefit of the rest, refit, or replacement troops, a force that had just fought a 3-month siege would ordinarily have been given first. The soldiers who fought at Fort Driant remembered the specifics of that fight more than almost anything else in their war. The cratered ground, the tunnels that swallowed men whole and returned them somewhere they had not expected, the sense of fighting an enemy that could simply disappear underground and wait them out. They remembered the 800 casualties producing nothing they could point to afterward, no ground held, no fort captured, just a withdrawal order in the middle of the night and a fort that stayed German for 2 more months after they left it. They remembered Patton's reputation for speed feeling, for the first time in their part of the war, like something that had worked against them rather than for them, an order to attack in weather and terrain that every officer on the ground could see was wrong, issued anyway because the alternative was naming a replacement. Some of them carried a specific bitterness about it for years afterward, not toward the German garrison that had fought hard and skillfully from a strong position, but toward a plan that had sent them at that position head-on when the ground and the enemy's own defensive advantages made a different approach obviously safer in hindsight. Others defended the decision exactly the way Patton defended it himself, arguing that nobody could have known in September how strong Driant's tunnel network actually was until soldiers had gone in and found out the hard way, and that the lesson learned there was what let the November envelopment work as cleanly as it did. They remembered, too, the specific texture of the ground itself, long after the details of unit movements and dates had faded, the smell of wet earth and cordite that never fully left the crater fields around Driant, the particular quiet of a tunnel entrance nobody wanted to be the first one to walk into, the sound of German voices calling to each other underground in passages the attackers could hear but not see. They remembered getting orders to pull back in the dark on the night of October 12th and feeling, for the first time in months of fighting under Patton, that they had lost. We should not forget the men who spent 2.5 weeks fighting for a fort they never took, in a war usually remembered for how fast Patton's army moved, rather than for the one place it was forced to stop. Did your father or grandfather serve with Third Army at Metz, at Fort Driant, or anywhere in the Lorraine campaign of 1944? Tell us his name in the comments below. And if you want more stories like this, the ones that were never supposed to reach you, subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss what's coming next. Thank you for watching.